Inching closer to peace, the Colombian government and FARC rebels reach a deal on reparations and the establishment of special courts. But how is this deal different from previous ones, and could it bring lasting peace in Colombia? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. It is the longest running guerrilla war in Latin America, but the Colombian government and FARC rebels have come one step closer to ending it. They've agreed to compensate victims and set up special tribunals, issues that were among the main obstacles during the nearly 3 years of peace talks in Havana. The goal now is to sign a final peace deal by the end of March. We'll get to our discussion on what this means for peace in Colombia in a moment, but first, Alessandro Rampietti has this report from Bogota.
It took the negotiators a year and a half of intense talks, but finally a deal on how to compensate the victims of Colombia's conflict has been reached.
Los colombianos tenemos una muy buena noticia para el mundo.
We have very good news for the world. This announcement foreshadows the end of the conflict and the possibility of a strong peace. Not just any peace, a true peace that places the victims at the center of it.
For the first time, FARC rebels say they're willing to use their assets for the reparation of the victims, and say they will work with the government to improve the regions most affected by the conflict. Representatives of the victims who offered proposals for the deal now say it will end decades of impunity.
Today we reclaim our dignity, our demands that the agreements can be true to the claims of all the victims.
The deal also sets out the procedures of a justice system that will try those accused of atrocities, rebel fighters, but also government soldiers and right-wing paramilitaries. While the rank and file will receive amnesty, the leaders responsible for war crimes will receive reduced sentences if they admit to their crimes.
This is the first peace agreement reached in Colombia that hasn't ended with a general amnesty, but instead with the creation of a special tribunal with powers to discover all the violations of rights and all those responsible for those violations.
Many Colombians remain skeptical of a deal that will let FARC leaders avoid prison, but experts say this agreement draws a fine balance between truth and justice.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that the goal here is to reach an agreement that will allow peace to come forth in Colombia after over a half century of war. And I think any other type of agreement that pushed too hard in terms of punishing the guerrillas and sending them to jail perhaps would have failed.
Now negotiators will move on to discuss the disarmament of the rebels, the last point of the agenda still standing. The long-sought agreement removes the last stumbling block in the talks, and it puts the negotiations back on track towards reaching a full comprehensive peace deal in time for its deadline on March 23, 2016. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogota.
Well, this conflict stretches back to the late 1960s when FARC and other guerrilla forces came together in an attempt to install a Marxist regime in Colombia. 2 decades later, paramilitary militias funded by wealthy landowners and drug lords were brought in to fight the guerrillas. Since the 1980s, there have been 3 failed attempts at negotiation between the government and FARC rebels. Former President Alvaro Uribe Vélez negotiated a settlement with the paramilitary, most demobilized by 2010. And in 2012, President Juan Manuel Santos resumed peace negotiations with the FARC that are still ongoing. So lots to talk about there. Let's introduce our 3 guests now. From Bogota, we have Paloma Valencia, a senator from Colombia's Democratic Center Party. And joining us from Washington, Jimenez Sanchez Garzoli, a human rights advocate at the Washington Office on Latin America. And also from Bogota, Maria Ibanez, a professor of economics at the University of the Andes in Bogota. So good to have you all with us. Thanks for joining us on Inside Story. Maria Ibanez, let me start with you. How significant is this agreement in your assessment?
I think this deal is very significant for the peace process. It really is one of the last obstacles we needed to reach the peace agreement in the 23rd of March, and is indeed good news. Basically, the FARC committed to truth, reparation, and restitution, and for going through justice tribunals, which is very important for the peace process.
Jimenez Sanchez Garzoli, what's your view on this? Is this a step in the right direction towards an eventual comprehensive agreement between the two sides in Colombia?
Well, last week I had the honor of being at the reconciliation ceremony between the Bogota victims massacre. These are Afro-Colombians who were affected by a launching of a cylinder into a church that incinerated 80 people and burned many others by the FARC. And I can tell you that just listening to those victims last week, this agreement really embodies and puts victims first. It basically prioritizes truth-telling over justice, but it still has different levels of gradients of justice that doesn't allow war criminals to get away completely with what they've did. It also addresses the multiplicity of actors involved in the conflict, which Colombia is a very complicated conflict, which is positive, and it really puts Colombia on a path towards reconciliation, which is really what is needed. And so this is a historic agreement. It's very important, and now a lot needs to be done to get it implemented.
There are those in Colombia who are very much opposed to this agreement, and Senator Paloma Valencia, I know you are one of them. Tell us why.
First of all, I want to say that what we feel is not if we want peace or not. Everybody in Colombia wants peace. The question here is how you will build peace here. And I think injustice is a trigger for new violence, because you're giving the wrong message to Colombian people. You're saying them that if you kill, if you kidnap it, if you put bombs, if you incinerated people in a church, you just can tell the truth and you will be free. You don't have to pay not even a day in jail. And it's true. They say they're gonna repair the victims, but they didn't give up their money. The money of the government will be devoted to make up the victims. And we feel there is, for example, Forbes in Israel says FARC is the third richest terrorist group in the world. FARC has been kidnapping people, extortioning Colombian people, and also is one of the biggest cocaine cartels. All this money should be given to the victims. However, the agreement didn't include this, and we're worried that this is just a wash up of the face and the hands of FARC, and they will have political power, they won't pay jail, and this is not the way in which peace could be built.
All right, let's put some of that back to Ana Maria Ibanez. There are some very real concerns for the victims' families about what they see as impunity for many of the FARC rebels in all of this, that they will essentially be no jail time for any of them as part of this reconciliation process. What do you say to that?
I really don't agree. Basically, what the FARC need to do is that they have to undergo through tribunals, justice tribunals, and if they tell the truth about the crimes they committed, they would have to be secluded geographically in a place. If they don't say the truth, they will have to go through ordinary justice. But what I really think it's important is that we are negotiating a political agreement with FARC, and the FARC did not surrender. So it was very difficult for FARC to agree to give up arms if that implied really long jail sentences. So basically what we're doing is that we're balancing truth, reconciliation, and justice for the country to be able to move forward, and to also to avoid more victims and to avoid more pain here in the country. So I think it's a good step. Of course, we would have liked a little bit more of justice or more justice, but really this is what the best that we could come up with, I think.
Jimenez Sanchez Garzoli, this is a compromise for sure, and you mentioned the victims' families earlier. There are many other victims' families, though, who didn't attend, were not represented here, and they're very unhappy about this deal. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that with all due respect, I think that Senator Paloma's point of view is very biased and is only looking at one side of the conflict. This peace process did not happen in a vacuum. There was prior peace process with the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, also a terrorist group. In that process, basically you had jail time, but you really didn't have the enforcement of truth-telling. This new process is looking into actually putting the victims first, getting the truth-telling, getting them to know what happened to their disappeared, why did it happen, and if they don't tell the truth, there are gradients of justice from first detention of liberty, then to a prison time, which is the same as the one that the paramilitaries got, and then if they don't do that, they will have 20 years in prison. So I think that this is a very biased point of view, and you need to look at Colombia in its full effect of the conflict and the multiple actors involved in it. And if you look at it that way, you can see that this is a great step forward. Yes, it is a step that has to take compromise because that's what you have to do to get a peace. And I would just reinforce, this has been the period in Colombia's history where there's been the most de-escalation of the conflict, when there's been the least victimization of people, least humanitarian situation. After so many years, this is really a huge step forward.
Yeah, I know you want to respond to that, Senator Valencia. This is a reconciliation process after all, and in any process like this, some very difficult compromises have to be made. The idea that you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies.
But yeah, but I could ask, how would everybody feels if ISIS just get impunity because they confess their crimes? Everybody knows what FARC did in this country. We don't need them to just go there and recognize the crimes because we already know they did that. We already know they burned people in Bogota. We already know they put bombs.
Right. But what about the point? What about the point that was just made that there are victims on both sides in this conflict? You talk about the FARC, but there are victims on the other side as well.
Well, of course, there are families suffering because guerrillas get killed and everything. But the thing here is you shouldn't think about the signing the agreement. You should think about the long term in Colombia. What is the message that Colombian people are receiving? That you can kill, you can kidnap people, you can recruit children, you can make child make abortions because they force sexuality to them, and after all you just tell everything you do and you go free and you can have political representation. What would the victims feel when they see these killers just going into office? How would you feel if it was your son or your daughter, it was your brother, your father? What I feel is that this process in the way it's built is making a lot of people feel it's very unjust. And injustice is it's a way in which violence become bigger.
Ana Maria Ibanez, how does this particular agreement compare to previous attempts made at reconciliation by both sides in this? What's different this time around?
Well, this is a very important question. The country has been undergoing a conflict during 50 years, and so we had several peace processes in the country. The last one was with the paramilitary groups. It was an imperfect agreement as well, but it was an important agreement. And this agreement, basically what it did is that they demobilized the paramilitary groups, and the paramilitary leaders and the paramilitary members went to jail. And they had to tell the truth. So the process of truth-telling of the paramilitaries was extremely imperfect. The justice was overwhelmed by all the processes that were done. And also, they did not restitute the victims as it was said in the agreement. Basically, they have provided only 6% of the restitution that has been done during the last year. So I really think that this is an agreement that builds on previous agreements, and it's better. I think what we're going to have is the FARC telling the truth, helping the government to find the people that disappeared, and helping us also in a process of reconciliation for the country, which is very, very important.
Jimenez Sanchez Garzoli, both sides in this have set a final date of March of next year for a final comprehensive agreement here. Do you think that that is within reach given what's already been agreed to now?
Well, first I'd like to say that the FARC has committed atrocious crimes against the people of Colombia, but they're not the only ones. So have the paramilitaries, and so have the armed forces with the extrajudicial killing of over 3,000 people. And this agreement actually takes all of them into account and will have a reconciliation process among all. I think that March deadline is perhaps unrealistic. It may take a bit longer to reach the final agreement, but it's important to note that this process has only been in process for 3 years. And for such a long, complicated conflict that has had so many previously failed process in a country where impunity is rampant on all sides, you know, it's pretty amazing that they were able to get as far as they did and as quickly as they did. And part of it has to do with the fact that it was a very serious agenda. It was a private agenda at first, and also the really important role that both Norway and Cuba played in helping moving this forward.
Senator Valencia, it's been said that this is a dividend for peace in Colombia that goes way beyond Colombia's borders, specifically the issue of illegal drug trafficking, global drug trafficking. Won't this deal go some way to combating that?
I don't think so. You know, Colombia has had many peace processes in which they promised peace, and we didn't have peace. Actually, after the 91 Constitution, we have the most violent history ever known in the latest history. And after that, they killed Pablo Escobar, and they say drug trafficking is finished in Colombia. Then it came the Cartel of Cali, and then they put it on jail, and we still have the same drug problems. Now in the process, they say they're going to finish cocaine. It isn't true. Colombia is now again the first cocaine producer in the world. We have the biggest crops of coke all over the world. And we have illegal mining. This is a very, very rich business in which you will have to pay a lot of armies to protect the legal business. So I don't think it's going to get to an end. And what I feel is that this new tribunal, peace tribunal as it's called, is going to have a lot of complicated issues in Colombia because it has been upon the opinion of FARC, a terrorist group, and the government. And it will be judging everybody, civil people, armed forces, and everybody. So I don't think there is any guarantee for the people, for the armed forces, and this kind of injustice that will be committed in this tribunal will bring to Colombia a lot of fighting, a lot of uncomfortable, and a lot of injustice feelings that will not build peace. I of course, hope to be wrong, but I feel this agreement is a very, very dangerous deal for Colombia.
Ana Maria Ibanez, what's your view on this? Will this agreement do anything to address the huge problem of global drug trafficking?
Well, I think that the problem of drug trafficking is much wider than the FARC. I mean, the FARC will be able to give some of the routes and will provide some information for the government. And the FARC would be hugely important for the producers of illicit crops. I mean, for the peasants that are producing crops, they can really contribute for reducing illicit drug production. But really the deal will not help significantly to stop drug trafficking globally. That's a huge problem. It involves a lot of actors in the world and in Colombia and in other Latin American countries, and it would be a little bit difficult for the agreements to solve such a huge problem. I think asking that for the agreements is a bit unjust.
Jimenez Sanchez Garzoli, what about the issue of displacement in Colombia? There are millions of Colombians who have been forced from their homes as a result of decades of this conflict. What is the dimension of displacement in Colombia? What implications is this going to have for people who have been forced to leave their homes there?
Well, Colombia has one of the largest displaced populations in the world, over 7 million if you count from 1985 onwards, and it disproportionately affects Afro-Colombian and indigenous people that have collective land titles. Most people in Colombia are displaced 3 or 4 times. You also have a large number of refugees in over 22 countries of the world. One interesting thing about the agreement that was put out yesterday is that it's going to look at how you bring back some of those refugees and find a way to get them to reconcile and go back to their areas of origin if that's what they want to do. Interestingly, Colombia is the only country in the world that put forth a land and victims law that tried to address displacement while the conflict was still taking place. And that law, while very ambitious and very nice on paper in terms of rights, was very problematic and had a hard time actually being implemented because the conflict was still taking place. It's very difficult to return people when illegal armed groups are still present in those areas and you're basically pitting them against the victimizers for them to return. I think with the peace process, we may be able to see actually that law implemented in a way that is actually useful. I think that there's going to take many generations to really undo all the damage done by the rights violations to the displaced people, but I definitely think that this is going to be an improvement in terms of security of displaced leaders and an effort to reconcile that situation that's been very much ignored.
Senator Valencia, I know you were shaking your head to some of that.
Well, what I think it's, of course, you need to attend displacement people. It is a horrible tragedy in this country. But what I fear is that FARC would not go away. They will stay there. Everybody will have the same feeling of fear that you have to them before, even though they cannot have weapons or you don't know if they have it. And what I think also is that Jimena pointed out, something that is very critical in Colombia is implementation of the law. We usually write very good laws. The paramilitary law in the process supposed them to tell the truth, suppose them to go to jail. It was it prescribed they should give up their money and compensate the victims. It was all written, so it didn't happen because our justice was not able to implement really the law and what it says. So what I feel is this law, it has lower standards than the one before, and what would come out after the implementation? Probably nothing. We will have exactly what we have now, just with the impunity and the hands washed for all the terror organization. And I also wanted to point out that probably Jimena thinks that terror organization FARC here has like a political motivation, so it should be treated as a different thing as or not a terror organization. But what I think is when you committed crimes against humanity, when you committed atrocity, when you did committed things that were terrorism, you should be treated as a terror organization.
All right, just in the couple of minutes we've got left, I want to look briefly ahead to the prospects for a final piece. There is this unsettled question now of disarmament and the mechanism by which the final accord will be ratified. Ana Maria Ibanez, I want to put that to you. What are the potential stumbling blocks there?
Well, I think the president did a risky move, asking for this democratic process. But I think that the Colombian population would be able to support and will support the peace process as it is right now. Really what we have to think about is the number of victims due to the conflict. We have 7.3 million victims, which is about 15% of the population. When you look at the number of deaths in the conflict between 1985 and 2015, it's 220,000 victims, which 81% of these are civilians. So really the costs that the conflict has exerted upon the population is an important consideration that we have to take into account when we go to this political process and this democratic process that will take place in a few months. And I really hope, and I'm hopeful, that the people of Colombia will support the peace process. I think this is a very important moment in Colombia.
All right, that is going to have to be the last word. Thank you to all three of you, Paloma Valencia, Jimena Sanchez Garzoli, and Ana Maria Ibanez. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. You can leave your comments to us, of course, on the program's page of our website, aljazeera.com. And we're also on Facebook. You can post your views on facebook.com/ AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Tweet us at AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and all the team here. Bye for now.